Okay, so this is very interesting because we are at an investor meeting fundamentally, and we are talking about manufacturing. How could that be relevant in any possible way? So just for me to get a sense of the room, can I ask you to raise your hand if it's the first time that you're here at this meeting? Okay, 30% of new people, so for the most people is here from a long time. How many of you are actual investors? If you are investors, raise your hand. Okay, 15, 20%. And if you are instead seeking for money, if you're looking for investors, raise your hand. So basically, 80% of the room is here by mistake. Okay. Okay, Dai, come on, help me out a little bit more. How many of you have invested in a company or is running a company that has a commercial product or a phase 3 or phase 2 pivotal? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, now those people keep the hand up, and then how many of you has a phase 2 or phase 1 product? And then finally, anyone that has preclinical, in a way? Okay. So the point that I'm saying probably is that we are interested in talking about manufacturing at this stage because we are beyond the proof of clinical validity for the concept of cell and gene. If you were 4 or 5 years ago, probably these were completely different discussion. But we are still ahead of the actual commercial delivery at industrial scale of the manufacturing. So I'm not saying that the clinical aspect and the biology now is a done deal, but is coming to the game as much important aspect that is bringing product to the market at a scale, at a price, at a cost, and at a quality that has to reach and match the quality of what is done for recombinant protein and the other aspect. And I guess this is the reason why we have this distinctive panel that today we are going to discuss about manufacturing, which is going to be the next challenge that basically every company and every investor will need to face in terms of materializing the opportunity and the aspiration of what we are trying to do today. So a little bit in general order, we have Andy Holt, which is all about partnering. He is VP of Business Development of AskBio, working on both partnership and manufacturing strategy. He is grateful that both seem to get going hand in hand and work very well and more frequently. Then we have, I jumped to the lady, I apologize, Susan, that basically is a Senior Vice President of everything, in the sense that she is the Senior Vice President of Pharmaceutical Development and Technology at Bluebird Bio. Her team sets the CMC strategy, develops the processes and the analytical methods, and supports the manufacturing for Bluebird portfolio of autologous hematopoietic stem cell and T-cell therapies. Basically, is at the heart of all the innovation. Then we have Paul, which is, I would say, at the frontiers in Pfizer for fighting for funds allocation into this innovative technology and making sure that the giant moves in the right direction of embracing what is the future. And practically, he is the medicinal science category lead for rare disease at Pfizer, where he has held director roles in development and manufacturing for over 10 years. Before this, Paul led the US-based process development for a CMO organization dedicated to oligonucleotides therapeutics called Avecia. Then we have Bruno, which is a Senior Director of Cell and Gene Technology Manufacturing Strategy at GSK. He is really at the heart of strategy and shaping the strategy of the approach of GSK to this new modality. He's currently developing end-to-end strategies spanning from discovery, product development, GMP operations, supply chain to support GSK cell and gene therapy platform and pipeline. So really think tank in the company to define how they will go forward. And last but not least, Luis, who is at the heart of probably what I would say as core development could be. He is the Chief Technical Operation Officer at Voyager Therapeutics. He has over 20 years of experience in biologic development and GMP manufacturing, and has held a number of senior positions at mid and large pharma, including Bristol Myers Squibb, Novartis, MedImmune, and Merck. So that's the panel. We will ask a question, and I will try to facilitate a discussion. but I very welcome question from the audience. So you raise your hand, and as soon as I see you, I will give you the word to move forward. So manufacturing is at the spotlight. And this high-profile panel is going to talk us about how is important the gene therapy manufacturing aspect of the overall business. And I will ask them what is their opinion in manufacturing and why we have to talk about that today. Probably as a CDMO, I have an opinion, but we want to hear what they are saying. And by the way, my name is Alberto Santagostino. I'm the head of Cell and Gene Technologies of Lonza, and I'm very honored to be able to moderate this panel. So if you don't mind, Luis, why, in your opinion, is manufacturing in the spotlight today?
Thanks, Alberto. I actually find it was interesting. I actually tried to keep score throughout the day, how many times manufacturing was being said, and I think there was not one single speaker that did not use the word manufacturing. And let's all be honest, the reason we're here is because, of course, the investors are concerned. And I think the reason we are where we are is that the science, in terms of delivery of the genes, understanding, particularly for monogenic diseases, we have 20 years of that research in the universities, but manufacturing is kind of 20 years behind. So that's where we are. So we need to catch up. We have to go from, I'll call it from kindergarten or maybe grade school straight to graduate school. That's kind of where we are. I think it's important, and what I think is going to be a big differentiator between companies. And it's not going to work out the situation. Let's figure out if they work on the clinic, and then we figure out manufacturing, because the phases of development are very fast. So you have to think about it from the beginning. But let's be honest. The main reason we're here is because, unfortunately, manufacturing in gene therapy cannot be taken for granted, like we do in MABs or other types of things we've been doing for so many years. So.
Thank you very much, Luis. Paul, taking the head of a big pharma like Pfizer, do you also agree that manufacturing needs to be in the spotlight for cell and gene?
Yeah, I think so. It's pretty simple. Clinical development timelines are very, very short compared to traditional development. You're typically talking 4 years, 4.5 years from first in human to submission, which means that you have to think about the end game in terms of how you're going to make the product almost before you dose the first patient. And I think that mentality, is a bit strange for people who are in traditional development, but I think even for small companies who typically will want to go to an investment point and then start to work on that. But if you don't think about that at the point you first dose, you're going to be behind the 8 ball.
And there is any different way how a big pharma thinks about or should think about cell and gene manufacturing versus a small player, or is the same?
No, I think that the power of the size, the good thing about it in gene therapy is we can use a lot of the biopharma learning that we've had, right? A lot of the engineering and the skills and the understanding to how to predict what the process is going to look like, and understanding that making changes during development comes with a price or a challenge. So if you can do your first study with something looking like the process that you're going to launch with, that makes it much more straightforward in terms of development. And I think that's what the regulators are telling us as well.
Thank you very much. Probably practically you are setting the stage for the next question that I wanted to ask to Susan. So if we think about manufacturing this way, sounds like the message is thinking ahead. So planning the manufacturing journey in cell and gene technology ahead of time seems to be important. And decision probably should be taken well ahead of the time to not be surprised. So Susan, from your perspective, what would you highlight to the investor community about this journey, about thinking manufacturing early on?
So first and foremost, I think we have to acknowledge where we are today. Luis made a reference to kindergarten, having to go to graduate school. So I think the immediate thing is to meet the needs of today. So Paul mentioned how fast the clinical programs move. So several companies are in the situation where we're nearing commercializing products with processes that are still fairly academic, low yielding, labor intensive. So we first have to make sure that those processes are robust enough and at commercially viable facilities so that we can meet today's needs. But very rapidly, we have to build for the future. We have to do that very thoughtfully. And it goes back to the principles that were used really to advance MABs to where they are today. We have to really understand the product. understand the critical quality attributes of that product and design the process to make sure that we are controlling that. And then plan ahead for all of the analytical studies and tech transfers that are going to be required to introduce those more advanced next generation processes into the clinic and into the commercial paradigm. So it goes back to fundamental good science in the labs.
I see. And you feel like the industry is ahead of this journey, behind of this journey, on the spot, or what's your opinion?
I think we're playing catch up a little bit, right? CMC tends to be a little bit of a bottleneck in the best of situations. And with the clinic moving so quickly, I think we're playing catch up, but things are advancing very quickly. We're making a lot of strides in terms of securing capacity and advancing the technology to ensure that these patients get these therapies that are so potentially transformative.
Thank you. Andy, why don't you bring in your perspective? What is your opinion, maybe also taking the angle of your company, of the approach to this journey?
Well, I think at the root of it, I've never come across a situation where you have too much vector, right? You hear a lot of times where people say their clinical trials have been delayed or affected by shortage. For us, we have a pipeline of programs, we have a platform for manufacturing. So I've been pushing since I came to AskBio to consider it that way, that the only consequences for us are generally dealing with good news if we're aggressive about how we plan at the beginning. Because as I said, we've had the situation where we've been producing vector pretty well, and somehow we find a home for it, right? Whether it's the board telling us we have to accelerate or all of a sudden, it gets repurposed. Ultimately, just on a practical sense, you have to budget for failure and then repurpose if you don't need it, I think. And if you're not doing that, then you end up in a really bad spot. So, we're AAV only, so we kind of have a narrower focus, I think, than some of the other folks on the panel. But for us, we can always reuse a slot. We can always repurpose. Even 2/3 of our raw materials can be swapped over for other things. So practically, I spend a lot of time trying to anticipate acceleration and success, and then figuring out what to do with it if we don't have that.
And in this spirit, how do you think about partnering and risk? Because there could be swings, and there could be needs of thinking, as you say, ahead of time.
I think we spend a lot of time considering how different the risk profile is in a gene therapy program, where early phase, even late preclinical data can be highly indicative to the point that you can make budgetary decisions for a program. And certainly once you're in the clinic, kind of to Paul and Susan's point both, you've got to start thinking the day you dose your first patient, if you don't have a commercialization plan, that's really intimidating from where you're sitting and first patient, you want to have a celebration, but you're actually spending a lot of time thinking about how on earth am I going to validate this process that we just dosed a patient with, that sort of stuff. So it's got to be, you've got to pull away from a risk-averse profile, or else you're going to get lapped. Ultimately, everything comes down to time for us, and we're willing to push really hard on budgets and on other things to save time.
Thank you very much, Andy. So as an industry, I think it's pretty clear that we are at an inflection point. There is a situation in which we are moving from clinical to commercial, from clinical validation to commercial execution. And this is thanks especially to the paradigm shift of these technologies in efficacy and in safety. The speed is pretty high. So what does this mean for an industry that basically till yesterday or 1 or 2 years ago was questioned about if it would ever materialize? And this is on the journey to becoming a mainstream. I would love to talk a little bit more about the challenges that we as an industry do face in this journey of moving from a potential promise that never materialized to actually mainstream treatment. In this specific aspect, I would like to ask Bruno from GSK, what kind of challenges do you face as you move from clinical to commercial? How have you have to think about this problem?
Right, yeah, thanks. So to change Luis's analogy slightly, I would say the transition between clinical and commercial manufacturing from a CMC perspective is where the rubber meets the road, right? So I tend to put the challenges in 3 different buckets. There's a financial component, and what I mean by that is that's where the process not only needs to work, but cost of goods considerations need to start being taken very seriously. The other financial component is the size of the investments that you start to need to make at that point become very large, and certain tough conversations start happening. The second bucket is around logistical. So that's when you start having to think very seriously about your supply chain. What is that going to look like, right, in this particular space? Is it going to be centralized, decentralized? Everything with an eye on maximizing patient access, right? And then the third bucket is regulatory, right? At that point, you need to start thinking about locking down your process. And if you are not in a position to lock down your process, then you need to start thinking about comparability strategies that you can follow easily.
How easy is to pull all this together?
That's why we're here, right? Well employed.
I understand. No, but what I want to get in the sense is something that is radically different from what a company like GSK was doing in the past and therefore requires a new way to approach the problem, or is something that is more copy-pasting archetypes that did exist in the company? And if I can allow myself, just give us a little bit of insight about how you actually are making it happen, because it's not obvious. Sounds like complex.
It is. And I mean, the infrastructure exists and we're utilizing the infrastructure that GSK has for drug development, but there are no cell and gene therapy manufacturing sites. So we're essentially building those, from scratch and making individual decisions around make versus buy, right? And then the other big question is, how much can we leverage our experience with biopharmaceuticals? I think we can to a certain point, but then the model breaks down and we're going to need to find a new paradigm.
Thank you very much. Maybe taking a slightly positive spin, Luis, what are I suppose there are also new opportunities, no, in this inflection point today versus yesterday. So if you would have to articulate, what are the new opportunities that these new modalities takes into the way of thinking about manufacturing and this journey?
Yeah, so again, I think we need to also take advantage of the fact that the regulators are very open, right, for us to actually move these things to the clinic. Some of the results are highly transformational. We're getting RMAT designations, breakthrough therapy designation. Of course, we have to figure out how to deal with that. So I personally think you actually have to think well before you dose your first patient, how you're going to get to commercialization. And I'm not talking about necessarily investing capital, but really having a plan from the beginning. And we are actually doing this right now pretty much at the preclinical stage. When we come what we call a very important transition, R2D transition, research to development, before my team actually gets involved on that, we already have a plan up to BLA. Now, is the plan right? Probably not, but it's a useful plan for us to actually get ready. And what I personally feel we need to challenge is that I think we cannot start with a process that makes absolutely no sense, and we know for sure we're going to change it. Either the expression system, or we're never going to be commercially viable. It's okay if the cost of goods is not optimal, but it cannot be 100 times what you think is financially viable. So I think those are some of the issues. But from a regulator's perspective, I think there's a lot of advantage of these new therapies. There's obviously more unknowns. The critical quality attributes, as Susan mentioned, are not as well established. So we need to work with the regulators to evolve those. So we are a little bit on the driving seat on some of those things. And I think the investors also, that's why we're here, right? Because there's a lot of promise of this therapy. The other interesting piece is that I was joking about this with some colleagues at other companies. It's a little bit of an interesting situation where it seems to me that if we actually, in a small company, if you allocate capital to manufacturing, it seems your stock goes up. So it goes a little bit, not sure against correctly with the financial models, but that seems to be right now what seems to be the case. And I think the way to think about it is mostly about risk allocation, right? We're mostly decreasing risk. If we do that, and we can decide, right, either we do manufacturing internally or we partner. I mean, the CMOs are doing a great job, but of course the therapies are not, or the technology is a little bit behind. I think the main advantage we have is the ability to talk with the regulators. I would say the RMAT designation is a great avenue. we can pick up the phone and call them, have a question, and they answer immediately. That's a huge advantage. This is quite analogous to oncology from a timeline perspective. I don't recall we have that access from a CMC perspective when I was working in monoclonal antibodies. And I think we have more access here. So I think we need to take advantage of it because the regulators are ready to help us if we actually engage with them.
Thank you very much, Luis. Sounds like a lot of opportunities, but they all boil down to speed. Mm-hmm. And this almost says that CMC is on the critical path in this journey. And we see a big acceleration in the trajectory to commercialization. We have all these breakthrough designation, and this is linked to the transformative efficacy of those therapies, which though on the other side put pressure and expectation on the shoulders of the company and on the manufacturing that those companies have to do. Because if on one side there is more willingness of the regulator to come along and accelerate those pathways thanks to the efficacy of those therapies, it's not that there is any give up or kind of indulgency on the quality of the CMC and the manufacturing. And so it's like we have the opportunity to do things faster, but you have to do the same amount of things. Right. And that could be quite a bit of a challenge because with shorter timeline, same CMC rigor. So maybe Paul, I have a question for you. How do you make it work?
I think the promise of these medicines, what I see as well from my background is that there is an ability to platform. There is an ability to use common approaches and technologies across different assets. So if you can, it's about industrialization theory, really, in a way. How do you move from something bespoke and custom to something that's essentially an industrial manufacturing process? And there's ways that you can do that. There's ways you can get the concept of production line into manufacturing where you standardize, analytics and manufacturing approaches, the type of plant that you're going to use. So if you're going to use single use, right, what you don't want to do is the next team coming through decide they're going to use a different manufacturer of subs, or that idea will enable us to move fast, to use platforming and standardization as we approach. Or if you're at a CMO, the CMOs will give you a lot of advantage as well. I think there was a lot of talk about CMOs this morning, but I think we have both make and buy. We've got great relationships with contract manufacturing organizations, and I think strategic partnerships with CMOs are the most important. I think in terms of sharing how you approach development, CMOs are very, very open to work with you and help you develop the product the way you want to develop it. I think there's value there. So standardization, have a positive approach to thinking about industrialization, because if we can't industrialize these things, we're going to prevent access.
Absolutely. Thank you, Paul. Andy, how do you manage those shorter timelines and yet higher expectation?
I think it's kind of a theme that's developing here. For us, having a platform, the two things that we really look to make sure that we're doing the right things, because we internally don't view it as there's really any time to redo much at all. Right? The idea that's kind of from other areas of pharma development where you maybe can retool after phase 2. Sometimes we don't even have a phase 2 projected in our clinical development, so how can you retool for something that won't exist for your development timelines? Luckily, the industry is still small enough and the techniques are finite enough that there's a lot to learn from other programs in the space, whether it's the good things they did or maybe the less good things they did, to try to avoid missteps. And then to Paul's point, we're a big believer in having a platform so that every bit of learning can immediately be incorporated either in the next batch or in the next program or in the next registration, because without that, a diversity of options A, requires too much expertise that is hard to retain, and B, takes too much time to redevelop and redevelop. So,
thank you. Well, at this point, you are basically creating me a new topic for discussion that I would like to deepen with Susan and Bruno. So it sounds like there is an important aspect and focus we should put on platform and standardization. And at the end is about manufacturing process and how much central role we will put into creating something that is reproducible, standard, and fundamentally having a platform into making this therapy a success. So Susan, how do you see technology platforms coming into play in your manufacturing process?
I think it's absolutely fundamental to continuing to advance the field. So speed to clinic will be dramatically increased for the first in human if we have a platform that we can leverage. It will dramatically simplify our supply chain. We'll be using the same raw materials for multiple programs. We could more easily, slot in, slot out manufacturing slots if the technology is all based on the same technology. But also, I think, and Jeff alluded to it earlier at his presentation about Bluebird, is we're really laying the tracks for the future. So we want to be in a scenario where we can leverage the technologies that we've developed to reach more and more rare diseases, and that has to involve a platform standardized approach as well.
Thank you very much. Bruno, do you see this need for platforms to simplify and help de-risk the current processes? Is that the key to success?
Well, it certainly was for mAbs, right? I think that the ability to manufacture mAbs, following a platform was transformational. I think that there were certain key technologies that really enabled that for mAbs. I don't know that I have seen those for cell and gene therapy. I think that, to Susan's point, the players that are able to have a platform in cell and gene therapy at this moment are those that have very focused pipeline. So when I tend to think of platforms, I tend to think of the entire field. And as we could tell, even in this day here today, I mean, the diversity and variety of things that we're still, quote unquote, playing with in cell and gene therapy is amazing. So I think that we as a field, not as individual companies, to narrow that down in order to have a more serious conversation about platforms. But agreed, if we could get there, it would be transformational.
I think you probably put a finger on a very important point, Bruno, is that we talk about cell and gene like if it is a modality like monoclonal antibody, but we are ranging from exosome to adenoviruses to autologous cell therapy and 3D manufacturing of allogenic, which I would say probably it's a collection of 15 or 20 different modalities. So platform probably yes, but need to be thought in a modality-specific approach.
If I may, I mean, you used two words that resonated with me in the question. One was platforms, the other one was standardization. I think the platforms were a little bit farther away, but the standardization, I think not only there is a huge opportunity, particularly around inputs, outputs, the middle part we can disagree with, it can be proprietary, but if we could start standardizing on inputs, outputs, say to regulatory files, that would be huge for the industry.
Maybe tell us a little bit more about that. How you think it?
I mean, simply, and then I would like to hear from my colleagues here, but raw material variability and how we handle that, to me, it feels like we're all doing it a certain different way, which is not helping. And then on the output side, how to release a batch, what are the key analytical methods. So those are just kind of two examples that would go a long way to helping.
Thank you.
I would add, we're doing something with ARM in terms of a concept called AGene, where we're looking at years ago, the AMAB program was a great way to sort of consolidate thinking on how to do, they call it, don't use quality by design as much anymore, but those principles of disciplined approach to development, it doesn't matter what modality that you're using, and that idea of how you control inputs and outputs, and that concept of developing a control strategy for a product, that's universal no matter what modality you're in.
That's very correct.
I think just one of the things that I find is a struggle is because the science is so kind of newly validated, there's the same sort of tinkering approach that continues way too long in the manufacturing side of things, when to me, manufacturing is primarily an engineering. Nobody is still tinkering with monoclonal yields in any significant way because it's good enough, right? And there's a lot of the group that really was foundational in gene therapy that is kind of repelled by the idea of good enough because they've been pursuing this for decades and they're seeing a field really come to fruition. But like, we don't need perfect. We need predictable and good enough. And so the idea that locking it down and validating, we just need to make the same widget. It's an incredibly complex widget, but we need to make a lot of them the exact same. And however that happens is almost immaterial.
Very good. Allow me to switch topic because I think we get quite into the aspect very important of platform and standardization. Let's say the aspect of anticipating demands and therefore production capacity. It's fair to say that the uncertainty and volatility is quite huge, not only because there is an aspect of clinical risk, but also because curative diseases has a completely different shape in the way of the demand will play out. We will have probably a bell shape opposite to the kind of slow ramp up to what is the prevalence. We will have a peak at the prevalence, and then we will go down to the incidence, requiring a rapid scale up of operation followed by a scale down, and therefore having suitable cost-effective operation are going to be complicated on top of the uncertainty of penetration, on top of the uncertainty, for instance, of the doses, make the variability and the risk pretty material. So on top of this aspect of the manufacturing process and cost and those aspects of lead time, this creates a lot of question marks that are difficult to forecast ahead of time. So on this note, Bruno, how does it work from a financial planning for those therapy versus the other?
So meaning a more chronic application versus a more curative?
Curative application with all the uncertainty on the demand pickup, speed, dosage.
Right, yeah, so that's where the biopharm model starts breaking down, right, for cell and gene therapy, and we need to do things differently. So, you know, there I think that we're gonna need to get comfortable with the idea of scaling out versus scaling up, right? So these big, huge stainless steel tanks that we built for the biopharmaceutical industry are probably going to need to be changed dramatically. And then the other thing is the cost of goods for a curative disease is going to be that much more important to justify that initial investment by the patients and payers. And then finally, just, you know, facility utilization, I think is going to be key, you know, to deal with this kind of much more personalized medicine approach.
I see. We'll more or less ask the same question to Luis and Susan. But Luis, in your aspect, what is your solution to manufacturing such therapies in a risk-sensible, financial-sensible way in consideration of the inherent swings that capacity may carry over versus demand?
Yeah, so it's actually a problem. We're currently already thinking about it. Because obviously, if you're going to be in a curative situation, you actually have a cohort, and the cohort may actually be large in the beginning, but then the incidence may actually be low, depends actually what is the mortality that happens on that specific disease. I actually think the only solution truly for that, I think there's two aspects you need to consider. One is platform, because you obviously cannot just build a facility that's going to be there for 20 years for the same product, right? So you actually have to do multiple products in the same facility, and the only way you can do is if all your manufacturing processes are platform. So it's very important to really standardize on one platform, not use too many, resist the urge to potentially go fast to the clinic, but let's actually go fast to BLA, because I think that's a much better approach, and one are not always the same. So I think that's one approach. The other thing, you also need to be thinking just broadly from a stability standpoint, how stable is your product? And do you plan that ahead? We're currently planning to actually demonstrate stability of our drug substance for 3 years and drug product for 5 years. Now, I'm not sure we're going to be able to demonstrate 8 years, going to be 3 + 5 or not. That's a discussion with the agency. We definitely intend to develop the data, but you know, stability, you have to start really thinking ahead of time. Because by the time you need it, if you didn't think 3 years before, you know, you don't have the data. So that's what I'm saying. So that's I believe you're going to be able to manage. Maybe you, in the beginning, you actually have intensive manufacturing. Afterwards, maybe you just have seasonal manufacturing, or you're manufacturing every couple of years, and you have to have enough stability on that. So you just need to have a plan these things ahead, and then it can be done. From a financial perspective for the company, we're not the first ones to face that, right? Gilead, with Arvoni, they kind of had that type of curve as well, you know, with Ab-C, right? So, you know, there's obviously manufacturing was slightly easier because it's small molecules, right? But you know, so something we have to deal, you know, on that. So it's important. I think platform is very important because we need to have other products to come out, you know, and we're never going to have chronic, right? I think even in genetic medicine, vector, for instance, at Voyager, one of our new platforms is vectorization of biologics, right? We have antibodies for both, you know, working on both Alzheimer for tau as well as for Parkinson's, but also those will not be necessarily those hopefully will be curative if they turn out to be like that in the clinic, and then the cohort will be smaller as well. So we have to be thinking about that, because not even those will be the same thing. It will also be curative potentially. So yeah, I think it's going to be important, and I don't know if there's other strategy, but at least that's what we're considering at Voyager. So.
Yeah. So if you don't have a pipeline of 30 products, in how many years do you depreciate your assets? 20, 30, or 5? Or 3.
Right. It is a challenge. I do think you need to have a pipeline, because if not, then you only exist for a couple of years where you cure all your patients, and that's fantastic, but you're not actually an organization for the long run. So you need to actually, I thought several companies showed this.
Use a CMO.
Yeah. Or you can also, you can also
Paul,
use a
how
CMO
many years
as well.
You depreciate your facility in new modalities?
What I would say though, is the strategy must be, for predictability, is to transfer CapEx to OpEx.
Sure.
So that's where the single-use technology and the scaling out thing, because you're still, when I first got involved in biopharma, we were doing the analysis of a fully loaded stainless steel facility is always much more efficient than a disposable facility for making monoclonals, right? But it's much more predictable, a lifetime, etc. But in these type of medicines, the ability to use single-use technology gives you the advantage, because you may be unsure of predictability, and then you have the prevalence curve as well. So if you can move the CapEx into OpEx, and you also get the speed associated with building those as well.
Thank you. So, Susan, how do you think about all this problem, about how you should think about the capital you deploy on the ground, and may become not that usable in the shorter term, or OpEx curve of people up and down?
Yeah, I think I don't have much more to add from what Luis and Paul mentioned, but I think there's also an aspect of a lot of these therapies we're going after are for very severe indications. So finding a way clinically to be able to change the safety profile so that we can go at a broader indication, I think is important. But the key is, efficient utilization of our manufacturing capacity, whether that's internal or external, via platforms, as well as making sure that we have a pipeline that is going to fill out the latter end of that curve after the initial bolus peaks.
Thank you very much. So probably my last question is bringing it back to investments. Unfortunately, capital is not infinite, especially for smaller companies that are probably here today to find their financing. Different for you, Paul and Bruno, but you probably have internal fights for capital allocation, which might be as hard as for a smaller company to find financial investor. So as there is only so much money you can invest in manufacturing infrastructure, and the risk and the benefit ratio is quite unique to gene therapies versus traditional therapies, how shall we think about this? And I would like to start with Andy, if it's agreeable with you. How do you budget and allocate funds on the manufacturing of gene therapies versus all the other way you can spend money? Increasing your pipeline, buy different assets, investing in R&D?
I mean, for us, we've pursued a joint venture strategy at AskBio to help mitigate some of that risk, where we have a partner that's willing to provide some of the CapEx, and then kind of to allude to Paul's, we provide the OpEx, which works out pretty well. But for us, it's clinical program design, manufacturing, everything else for the programs that we have. Because you can, without a clinical program design, you don't know how much to make, so you can't set a budget. But that's our order of operations, is designing and getting regulatory feedback on the best trial design that we can, and then finding out how much vector that needs, and then setting the budget on that. It's a dependent variable for us, but it's one that impacts the selection criteria up front for which programs we pursue. There are areas that we could address really quickly and easily right now from a scientific point of view, but the manufacturing tech can't get us there. The population's inaccessible. So we're keep a list of those, and as soon as we see some R&D from the tertiary or quaternary kind of aspect of R&D development in our platform, we'll come back to it. But for the short term, manufacturing is a filter for what we address, and then it's a dependent variable for what we budget.
So it's an element of your decision making.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we can't go after it. If we can't make it, there's no point.
Bruno, how do you pitch for investment for gene therapy versus more traditional therapy within your company? How do you persuade them?
Very carefully. No, I mean, it's one of the risk benefits of working for a larger company with a more diversified portfolio, right? I mean, there are pros, but some days I'm very envious of some of our colleagues who have a more focused pipeline, specifically on cell and gene therapy. I mean, I'm competing with, you know, products that are small molecules, biopharms that are already revenue makers, and you know, it's a tough pitch to allocate some of those revenues into something with, let's be honest, something that has a pretty low probability of success, especially with those lenses, right? So it's almost, if I could take the other modalities out of the equation, it would make my life easier because there wouldn't be that temptation to compare between my request and what's been working for the last several decades. So, but it's exciting.
Thank you very much. Susan, more or less the same question, but I would like to know, how do you think about capital allocation within a company that is actually fully dedicated to cell and gene? So where is better to spend the $1 of money? In R&D, in PD, in manufacturing, into commercial? Because that's commercial advertisement or kind of things like this.
Yeah. I mean, we have similar discussions, but all of our portfolio is focused on cell and gene therapy. But we do have a mix of severe genetic disease programs as well as oncology. So in the severe genetic disease arena, a lot of times you have a better idea of the chance of success preclinically. You have better models. It's easier to determine the potency of the drug product, for example. But those patient populations are very small. On the flip side, we have oncology programs where the attrition in the clinic is probably going to be higher. So speed to advancing those programs is more important, but they also utilize more manufacturing capacity because there are more patients. So it's a tough decision. And again, we at Bluebird tend to try to make the decision with the patients in mind, and how can we best reach the largest patient population with the resources that we have.
Thank you very much. Closing question for all of you. So let's assume, hypothetically, that you are so lucky enough to be sitting on a stage with a room full of investors, just as an hypothesis. What is the one thing you would like them to walk away out of this room? I'm not going to pick on you. You just go in the order you like. So what is the message you want to leave to the room?
Again, I'll come back to the, why do we have this panel? So I think it's important to remember, and then when you are looking to, you have to do your evaluations of the different companies, comparative, relative analysis. I'll be ask very thoughtful questions about the companies and what is their strategy. I think if you don't see a well laid down strategy, there's multiple ones that it's not one size fits all because there's different capital availability, but there has to be a sound strategy. And then, if some people are saying that things look too easy, I'll be skeptical. So, because as we know, these things are hard. That's why we are in this panel. So,
thank you much. In respect of time, I challenge the rest of the panel with one sentence. Andy, you always have one sentence ready.
It's really exciting that you care about this now.
I don't know that I can do it in one sentence, but just to try to balance, the challenges that you heard here today on manufacturing with the advance of the science. I mean, let's not let one hinder the other. I think there are solutions we can come up with in the future.
I would say, what we're trying to do is hard, but it is very scientifically stimulated. So there are a lot of really good minds working on it. And most importantly, it's worthwhile because of the potentials of these therapies. So we've got it.
I would say stick around for the manufacturing presentation.
Thank you very much to all of you. I apologize if I've been a little bit provocative, but I tried to energize a little bit also the fun of the discussion. As you probably can take as a flavor out of what we were trying to pull together, is that this is a journey of industrialization, And as a community, we will have to work it through. There is not a clear answer. It goes through platform, it goes through standardization, it goes through optimal partnering and planning for the way forward. But for sure, manufacturing has to be on the agenda of any company that wants to move forward in cell and gene technology, because it's probably the next hurdle after the clinical evidence of safety and efficacy. Thank you very much.
Thank you.